Hello, friends, and welcome back. Today, I want to do a lesson on the Egyptian dynasties. I did like a more general lesson earlier, so this is kind of just like all the pharaohs and kings and kind of how life was a little bit through each dynasty, so we can kind of go a little bit more in depth. So I hope that you enjoy this lesson. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is a priest named Manetho, who lived in about 300 BCE. Manetho was thought to be the first person who divided Egyptian kings into their traditional dynasties. So he created these dynasties from the beginning of like the unification and it went until Egypt was taken over by Persia. So scholars have discovered many years after this, they consider a part of ancient Egyptian history. So they've like added on to this. And then there's what scholars have called Dynasty O, which is 0. It's like Dynasty 0. And these rulers and dynasties predate the unification of Egypt. So they say that dates before the middle of the first millennium are more approximate than they are after that, because the dates could be corroborated by like the Assyrians, Macedonians, Romans, so like neighboring empires could kind of like confirm those dates. So we're gonna start with the first dynasty. So Dynasty 00 is pretty much anything before this, and this is like as far back as we can go. So this is everything before that, right? So the first dynasty of Egypt was between 3150 and 2890 BCE. Goals during this time were to increase trade, expansion of the kingdom, this would be done through military campaigns and building projects. Pretty standard for like any civilization, right? So the first king of this dynasty was Menes, and he lived in Memphis. He had many significant cultural achievements. He got to the throne through marriage. He instituted and reinforced certain government and religious traditions that were really important to how Egypt functioned and the religion like later. So at this time, there were types of mathematics. There was a calendar. There was like astronomy, which also obviously means that they had like papyrus and they could write. They had like a census already, which is amazing. They had tax assessments. During this time, the achievements in astronomy and like astrological instruments was really big for like their science later. So Menes was also called Narmer when he was like king. That's what people referred to him as. And his queen was named Neithotep, which I think that's a really pretty name. She may have been the first female ruler of Egypt after his death, which is great. That was so long ago. I think that's fantastic. First dynasty. So all the kings that followed Narmer continued to keep his policies. Into play in working order. Also unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Because they used to be separate. There's like northern and southern. Of course, it was like divided because the Nile ran north to south. So they would all have lived along the Nile, of course. He established a central government. Which first started in Thinis before moving to Abydos. And then finally, it ended in Memphis. So, Nithotep was born in Nakada. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Nakada? It looks bad. Hold on. It's an A. That's a Q. That's an A-D-A. So he married her to kind of solidify his rule and to unite Nakada with his kingdom. A lot of religious practices were developed at this time. And a lot of like building projects. So Narmer was that to have taken like a military down to southern Egypt to kind of like put down rebellions, the people that were like popping up, and they also expanded territories such as Nubia and Canaan. And if you know anything about the Bible, Canaan is like a big city. I think it's where Joseph was from. And then he was like taken as a slave back to Egypt. Interesting. That's from the Bible. And then after he died, of course, his wife ruled Egypt, is what they believe, for a little while. The next ruler of Egypt was Horaha from 3100 to 3050. So they believe that Horaha was most likely the son of Nithotep and Narmer. He continued his father's policies and his military campaigns in Nubia, but seems to have like moved out or neglected Canaan. For some reason, he just like didn't care as much about it. So he was known for his interest in religious rites and building a type of tomb known as a mastaba, which is kind of like a bench. And this was kind of like a precursor for the pyramids, for like building tombs, a mastaba. And it just like annoys me. And yeah, like the bench, you can kind of see it's like, you know, kind of like the beginning, the bottom base of like a pyramid. So after him was Jur. There's no way I'm saying all these names right. So he's 3050 to 3000 BCE. And he's probably the son of Horaha. He largely concerned himself with building palaces, and he was interested in military expansion. He extended his rule through Nubia again and then back into Canaan. And he was able to grow trade and industry under his reign. Interesting. The next one was Jet, who obviously is probably related to Jer, probably the son. As we all probably know, Egypt was really big about keeping their lineage, their blood in rule. So as was pretty much anyone who was like a king, who had a kingdom. So not a lot is known about this guy, actually. He died in Abdos, and his wife's name was Mernith. Oh, can't read that. And she outlived him. He just wasn't, there just wasn't a lot of information, and we can really only go from what we can find, right? So his wife, Marineth, she is the mother of one of the more well-known and revered pharaohs of this time, Den. He was probably considered the most revered since Narmer, and they think that maybe Merenith ruled maybe while Den was actually a child. So this is from 3000 to 2990 BCE. I forgot to write that. So she kind of took over at 2990. And that's also when Den was considered pharaoh. So they would think that when he became pharaoh, like when he was a child. And so she kind of like ruled Egypt while he was a child and like taught him how to do that. But he was considered pharaoh. So he's from 2990 to So Den was an important guy. He was the first one depicted with wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So that's kind of a big deal. So that's like he was the first one, this obviously indicates his dominance over the whole entire Egyptian region. So he ruled Egypt for 50 years and enlarged the country through military conquests, which, I mean, I wouldn't consider that great now, but they did then. He started kind of building temple complexes, which is a big deal. And elaborate tombs. So that's kind of the beginning, starting with like the elaborate tombs and stuff like that. Trade flourished under his rule. The god Hapi, who's the bull-headed god, was introduced during this. Oops. It was also began as the cult of Apis. It's like kind of what started this god, the creation of her. He was considered the greatest king of the first dynasty, Den. He was the best one. Next we have Anajib. Again, I'm definitely not saying these right, but I'm going to do the best I can. He was from 2940 to 2930 BCE. He was possibly Den's son, of course, but people actually think he's most likely his son-in-law. He is one of the few where his reign is characterized by rebellion. So he wasn't one of the best. They actually don't know a lot about this guy, maybe because people didn't like him. Next is Semerkhet. 2930 to 2920, so not too long. We'll go on 10 years at a time here. Oh yeah, that's BCE, of course. So he was considered a usurper of Anajib because he desecrated his name on several artifacts. He like scratched it out. This was, however, after they found something called the Cairo stone, it was like debunked because it showed his legitimate reign to the throne, like how he became king. And it seems as if he had just as difficult a time keeping everything together as this guy. So maybe he just didn't like him. Just humans, But thousands of years we've been the same. So the last pharaoh in this dynasty is Ka, who was from 2920 to 2890. 30 years? BC. I feel like I have to write it every time. He was the last ruler of the first dynasty. This guy right here, Ka'a. Very little is known about his reign, except that he was very prosperous. And it lasted about 30 years. He was a relative of Samarkand. Many think, of course, that it was his son, possibly. After his reign, they think maybe either he had more than one son, or he had no children of his own because war broke out after his death. And there were two people who decided that they were going to reign in his place, and one of them was named Snefrka, and the other was named Horus Bird. So these two were fighting for the throne after he died and a war broke out. This was all resolved by a man named Hotepsekemwe. Hotepsekemwe. He resolved, or I don't know what happened, but he somehow resolved this war, and he's the one who started the second dynasty because he's the one who came into rule next. So as you can see, the kings of the first dynasty were actually pretty efficient rulers. They did a good job for having nothing to work off of, except for these guys. They had some troubles. Who really knows why, but they just couldn't cut it. Historians seem to think that in this dynasty they were pretty aware of urbanization and overpopulation and conservation of resources and stuff like that, which is really interesting. They probably, they don't know how abundant things are going to be in the future and stuff like that. So that's really interesting. Not as much is known about the second dynasty. There was a lot of unrest and a lot of war plagued the second dynasty between Upper and Lower Egypt. So many thought of the second dynasty as a bridge between the first dynasty and the consolidation of the third dynasty. So this is obviously a bridge, but it's a bridge between the founding of government and then how they then solidified it in the third dynasty. So we talked about this guy a little bit. He was the first ruler of the second dynasty of Egypt. He resolved the conflict in the first dynasty and ruled for approximately 30 years. Pharaohs in the second dynasty only have approximate dates, so they're not 100% sure how many exact years they reigned for, but they think he reigned for about 30 years. His name means two powerful ones are at peace. Interesting. Raneb is next. They think he was possibly the brother of Hotepsekmenwe. They think he ruled for about 15 years. So he was the first one to connect Ra to his name, therefore establishing that he was directly related to the gods. So that's where that kind of like came from, was from this guy. This is also where images of Bastet came from, the cat-headed god. So Raneb pushed for more religious aspects of culture. So religious iconography. So, images, the image of Bastet, images of gods, him connecting himself to Ra, all that stuff. And he pushed for a more like peaceful existence than his predecessor. History kind of still depicts that there was like a lot of unrest at this time. Next is Ninniger. So during his reign, he actually split the country back in half. They think this is because there was still a lot of like difficulty, and there may have been like a famine, and he thought it would be easier to deal with if he split the country up, which is interesting. It's also debated that maybe it was still like rebellion and not a famine. And there's also a rumor that this pharaoh gave women the right to rule. Which is interesting because there was a woman in the first dynasty who ruled for a while. But this is also contested. They don't have a lot of like specific evidence for that. So next is Peribsen. He was also known as Set Peribsen, which kind of was like a political like thing because one of his rivals had Horus in front of his name. So it was like Horus's rival on the throne. I'm not really sure, but that's what he called himself. He was known for implementing a lot of cultural changes. Many consider that the adoption of Set's name at that time, it represents like kind of like a significant change in the way, in like its religion and the way it was being ruled. Also, the cult of Horus was in Lower Egypt, and his name isn't seen a lot in like Lower Egypt, so they think that maybe he like distanced himself from them, and that was part of the reason he adopted that name, because he like didn't agree with those things. Or for a while many thought he was the first like monotheist, so he was the first person in this time who believed in like one god, but that has since been debunked since there were multiple gods that were worshipped under his reign. So he did do some good things. He encouraged literary practices and religious practices, and on his tomb is the first recorded complete sentence in Egypt. So that happened at this time. The sentence reads, "The Golden One, he of Ombos, hath unified and handed over the two realms to his son, the king of Lower and Upper Egypt, Peribsen." So, he of Ombos also means Set. The last pharaoh we're going to talk about today is This was the last king of the second dynasty. May have been the son of Peribsen. It also, they think, could have been a rival that defeated him in battle. They're not sure. So they believe that after he either defeated Peribsen or legitimately took his place on the throne, that he again unified Lower and Upper Egypt. Many believe that his successor actually still ruled over both parts of Egypt. He just didn't go to like Lower Egypt. And if that was the case, then this pharaoh here strengthened the bond between Lower and Upper Egypt. It was like a big deal. He initiated a lot of like building projects that can still be seen to this day at Abydos. He's also the father of Djoser, who is a really important figure in the third dynasty, which is also the beginning of the Old Kingdom, which is what we're going to talk about next time. So I hope that you enjoyed this lesson about the first and second dynasty. We'll be continuing with the Old Kingdom, the pre-dynastic period, Middle Kingdom, and there's a bunch after that and in between. But we'll be hitting them all and going through as many things as we can. A lot of information isn't there, but we're going to do the best we can. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.